Thank you everyone for joining the Hornets Policy and Politics Alumni Chapter today for a conversation about the issues of access and diversity in California's higher education institutions. I'm Angela Marin, I'm HPPA's current president. We're excited to bring you the next installment of our What's Possible signature event. We usually hold these in person and as a luncheon. So today it's a brand new world for us doing a virtual event. I'd like to thank our partners, the American Society of Public Administration and the Sacramento State Alumni Association for helping us make this event possible. In terms of logistics, we have about 45 minutes for a discussion with our panelists. Our moderator will ask questions to them. And then at the end of the hour, we'll have 15 minutes for a Q&A event or a Q&A session with our audience. So please send in your questions in the chat box. We will be collecting them, and our moderator will be selecting questions to ask our panel at the end. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the event. Her name is Sausin Marar. She's a school accountability and culture reporter from the Sacramento Bee. Sausin, please take it away.
Hi, thank you for having me this evening. I'm so excited to be introducing our panelists today. Today we have with us Kevin Cook. Kevin is an Associate Center Director of the PPIC Higher Education Center. His research interests include education finance and policy for both K through 12 and higher education. And his current work focuses on performance-based funding, online learning, and public pensions. We also have Linda Vasquez, who's the Assistant Vice Chancellor of California Community Colleges. She has 15 years of experience working in higher education and advocacy. Prior to joining the Chancellor's office, Linda served as Senior Public Affairs Director for the Campaign for College Opportunity, a nonprofit advocacy organization. And also we have Dr. Viridiana Diaz. She has been in the field of higher education for the past 20 years. She serves as the Associate Vice President of Strategic Student Support Programs at Sacramento State. She has dedicated her professional career to creating a more inclusive campus for first-generation, Pell eligible, migrant, immigrant, undocumented, LGBTQ, and other school youth. She provided primary oversight to equity programs offering academic advising and more. And we also have Fabrizio Mejia. He serves as the Assistant Vice Chancellor in the Division of Equity and Inclusion at UC Berkeley. The programs under his oversight includes Basic Needs Center, the Center for Educational Equity and Excellence, Disabled Students Program, and Equity Inclusion STEM programs. His area of expertise includes multicultural counseling, support and supporting undocumented students. You can read all their full biographies on the Hornets Policy and Politics Alumni Facebook page. And thank you for joining us as well, to all of you watching from home. I want to start with Kevin Cook. Given your research, what's the data that shows us the demographic composition of California's public higher education institutions, and why should we care?
Thank you, Susan. And I just want to take a minute to just say thank you for including me in this. I'm a proud Sac State and PPA alum, and it's an honor to be here with such great panelists today. So I really appreciate it. So as was said, my name's Kevin Cook. I'm the Associate Director of the Public Policy Institute of California's Higher Education Center. And a brief disclaimer, and maybe folks who don't know PPIC, it's an independent, nonpartisan independent research institute that focuses on California state policy. We don't take positions on legislation or endorse candidates, and any opinions you hear today are mine and not that of the institute. So my role here really today is to provide a bit of context for our discussion. I promise to keep it brief. I know PPIC has a reputation for data dumps, so I will keep it as brief as possible so we can hear from the other expert panelists. So I'm going to start with sort of the second part of the question, which is sort of why do we care about this subject? And to help, I'm going to share my screen here for a second so that we can get some data into this discussion. So the simple answer to the question, why should we care, is that higher education serves as a ladder of economic opportunity in California. Closing gaps in access and completion at the state's public colleges and universities can narrow California's persistent economic divide and then also help the state meet its future workforce needs. You've heard maybe in the past the number of California needs 1.1 million additional bachelor's degrees by 2030 to reach its workforce needs. We've been chipping away at that, but it's still a steep hill to climb. So first, I think it's important to note that we know that people who graduate with a bachelor's degree earn far more than less educated individuals, and that gap has grown significantly over time. As of 2018, which is the latest data I have on this, bachelor's degrees holders on average earn about twice the income of individuals with a high school degree or less. And compared to 1990, after adjusting for inflation, workers with less than a bachelor's degree earn about the same today as they did 30 years ago. Additionally, individuals with a bachelor's degree have been somewhat insulated from the most recent severe recessions. This chart shows that the job gains and losses across the US from January 2000 to January of 2020. These trends generally hold for California as well. So during the Great Recession, about 1.2 million workers with a bachelor's degree lost their jobs, compared to about 5.7 million workers with less than a bachelor's degree. Now we're seeing this again in the current pandemic-related recession 12 years later. About 4 million workers with a bachelor's degree have lost their job as of January, and versus about 16 million workers with less than a bachelor's degree. So you can see the scale is larger, but the difference is about the same. So furthermore, we know that though there have been recent improvements, and I'd like to talk about those later, maybe in the discussion, persistent gaps remain between race and ethnicity in California when we look at the educational pipeline. So this chart shows if you take 1,000 current California ninth graders, we can look at see sort of what happens along that pipeline as they pass these sort of key milestones. And this development is sort of based on completion rates at each level. Currently, the rate of college completion for Black and Latino students is about half as high as white students and about a third that of Asian students. You can see some of the largest inflection points here are attending a four-year college, and then as well as then there's this little bit of a steep drop off when we're trying to get to completion as well. So a contributing factor to these gaps has been a lack of access to the state's four-year public colleges, particularly the UC and then the other highly selective universities in California, including a few CSUs and the nonprofit privates as well. As a state, California ranks 41st in the share of recent high school graduates who enrolled in a four-year college directly out of high school. On the flip side, California ranks 4th in the country in the share of recent high school graduates who enroll in a two-year college. This is somewhat by design. The Master Plan for Higher Education directs the top 1/8 of high school graduates to the UC, top 1/3 to the CSU, and then about 2/3 of the rest are directed to the community college system. There's a significant problem though, in that about only 40% of students intending to transfer from the California community colleges actually successfully do so to a four-year institution within 6 years. So increasing access to four-year institutions is critical to closing equity gaps and increasing economic mobility in the state. Policymakers, higher education institutions, they have many tools to increase access and completion, which we'll be discussing today. But at every step in the path from high school to college completion, an emphasis must be placed on ensuring that low-income students and underrepresented students have the information, access, and importantly, the support system they need to reach their educational goals. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can get on with this discussion.
Thank you. You provided really interesting data for us to think about, particularly in this discussion. For our other panelists who are from the community colleges, CSUs, and UCs, just looking at those graphs, I'm curious, what you think about what that means depending on a student's race. What is the system at your college or university? What is your system doing to increase access and diversity? And if you can also share, what are some of the challenges in doing that? Fabrizio, do we want to start with you, if you don't mind?
Sure. I think it depends on what part of the process we're talking about. So when we look at, for instance, the recruitment and outreach piece of that, I'll put in the chat. One of the things we have is what's called the Center for Educational Partnerships. That's really focused on partnering with community colleges and high schools, specifically ones that tend to be, we ask ourselves the question, who's not applying to a UC or to Berkeley, specifically in our case, and then backwards map from that. What are the reasons why there are not applications coming from that area? And then CEP and our Office of Undergraduate Admissions figure out how do we allocate resources to be there more consistently, whether that be, and many of our alum and folks from the communities, our partners in the organization say, we don't want a one and done. Don't come in and just give us a presentation. We want consistent access. And in many cases, the decision is a family one. So how are our approaches linguistically tailored, family tailored, or otherwise? And I'll give you another example. One of the things we've done recently is really look at the notion of basic needs. You know, what is it, what's happening in terms of housing and food insecurity, and how do we push out the resources that are available at the campus so that students understand when they're making a decision, what is available to them to support their success, not only in the application process, but as they make a choice and then through the university.
Anyone else like to join? Linda?
Yeah, what I can speak to is a focus on diversity. First, I just want to thank you all for having me here. And thanks for the question. You know, I just wanted to, share that the community colleges are open access institutions. And I know your question was about how to increase access. We serve, 100% of students who want to earn a degree or certificate or who want to transfer, or those who just want to take a few courses to gain skills to get back into the workforce. But because we're open access institutions, our work has really been focused on ensuring that all of our students are meeting their educational goals. And if you haven't had a chance to take a look at the system's Vision for Success goals, you can look at the goals we've outlined over the next 5 years to increase the number of students who are transferring, increase the number of students who are earning an associate's degree or certificate or credential. But two of the most important strategies that the community college system has really utilized to double down on our work to improve success and our efforts to improve our faculty diversity is one, to act with urgency, and the second is to utilize evidence-based policies to close racial equity gaps. And that includes everything from placement policies to investments on improving transfer to degree completion. And as I mentioned, I really want to focus on an example of how the community college system is working to improve the diversity of faculty. In 2018, and it's hard to believe that now we're in 2020, our Board of Governors mandated that our system create a plan to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in our workforce. And that work has culminated in a unanimous support by the board, or culminated a year later, the implementation of a statewide statement for DEI that is going to dictate and really serve as our North Star for our entire system. Everything from the way we approach equal employment opportunity, the way that we submit reports, our colleges submit reports on how they're improving their faculty hiring, and even funding allocations for equal employment opportunity. Now, the board approved that DEI plan as an integration plan to be implemented over the next 5 years. And that included 68 recommendations. Very ambitious over the next 5 years. But the thing is, we are all seeing what unfolded before our eyes in 2020. Our system can't wait 5 years. And in June, in response to the murder of George Floyd and social unrest, our chancellor came back and asked us to step into this work, asked our colleges to speed up the implementation of this DEI work because our students can't wait 5 years. And I can share, in the link, a copy of that DEI report, but I know the question will come up eventually. I wanted to share that while we are, many of us on this call, and I say this with my Linda Vasquez hat, not necessarily my chancellor's office hat, is that we may be defeated by the results of Prop 16 and what that could have done to bolster our diversity and equity and inclusion work. But we shouldn't let that stop us from continuing this work. In fact, for I believe many of you on this call, certainly for the chancellor's office, that work started long before Prop 16 made it on the ballot. And just because it was defeated does not mean that it absolves us from this work. It remains critical to student success and equity and was part of our core mission before. So that work should continue. And it just means we have to be more innovative in how we do that and continue demanding to the state legislature the resources we need to be able to implement this work.
Right, thank you. I want to give Veridiana a chance to chime in as well.
Sure. I wanted to emphasize the importance of looking at two very different strategies when increasing access and diversifying our campuses. There's definitely a strategy to recruit and reach out to freshmen, and there's a very different strategy for transfer students, right? And I know that for freshmen, these are students who are still 17 years old, sometimes even a little bit younger. Fabricio mentioned the importance of integrating the family, which I think is really critical with those communities that are first generation, that are the first in their families to go to college, because if we integrate the family early on, the family will have a lot of influence. The family will be supportive of every decision throughout the way. Also, the financial piece is very critical at that phase as well. So integrating financial aid and how the family is going to be able to afford higher education is also critical, and definitely having that cultural competence to be able to connect and relate to our families of color is also going to be critical. On the transfer side, it's a little bit different in terms of the strategy that we use to increase access, because transfer students are a bit older. They also have a better idea of what they want to study and career that they want to pursue. So doing much more intentional outreach, where we utilize academic programs that we offer. You know, for example, we have a law enforcement candidate scholars program that focuses on increasing the students of color that go into careers in law enforcement. You know, there's a MESA engineering program that specifically targets students of color who may be interested in pursuing a career in engineering. You know, there's also a program called PAL, the Peer Assisted Learning Program, that helps students advance in careers in STEM and science, engineering, and technology and mathematics. So for transfer students, definitely the strategy is different than for freshman students. And for transfer students, focusing more on the career focus, particularly addressing areas where students of color are not represented, right? And then for incoming freshmen, definitely working with them early on when they're still in high school, integrating the family, addressing the financial piece, letting the families know that they will find some type of support and sense of belonging when they come to Sacramento State or to any institution that they are planning to attend, right? And making that connection to some type of support program, because that is a primary concern from our families. Our belief is that if we can convince the family to support the student to attend a four-year institution, the student will likely come. But if we go through the student and convince the student first, the student will struggle to convince the family to support them throughout the way, and sometimes they will choose not to come.
That's a very good point. And you know, with all of you mentioning things that your institutions have done, I'm curious to know about some ideas that you or your institutions have that could possibly happen in the future. What are some implementations that we could see in the future? Maybe something you would like to see in the future to help with diversity. Linda, would you like to go first?
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to ask that question. I was trying to address the question in the chat box.
No problem, no problem. I was asking if there are any changes or potential solutions that are not formed yet, that maybe something that you would like to see or that your institution is considering in the future that could help with diversity.
Yeah, I think the low-hanging fruit, and I hate to call it that, but you look at all the people who supported you know, Proposition 16, right? Those are the people who need right now, and the organizations and the systems. Our board of governors supported this policy. I know that the ESU and the UC did too. Is let that not defeat us, and only invigorate us on what we need to do moving forward. There's clearly a group of stakeholders in our state who value this work and see it as important. Maybe that just means we need more convincing, right? And to double down on a new strategy. But I think we can talk about solutions, but all of those won't work if we're not recognizing that we have to act with urgency. So if a system hasn't developed a plan, and I'm only 3 months into this position at the chancellor's office, but I have to say that this system has been working on this body of work for years, and I'm helping to scale it, but they've been doubling down on this. So if a system or a campus doesn't have an action plan for how they're going to implement it, they need to do that now. They need to have those discussions. It's part of our DEI task force. And in fact, I'm going to, after I answer this question in the chat, I'm going to drop a link to the full report we released in February. Now our focus is on developing work groups, and those work groups are going to implement those 60+ recommendations, and we're meeting frequently. So I think that is something to toss out there, that frequent communication. I think now, although we may not like the way that it is, the webinar format meetings allows us to meet more frequently, whereas distance and travel may have been a challenge. And I think that even then we have to recognize that there are very minimal resources. So to be able to do this work, we are going to need funding. So that funding to support professional development for faculty, for college leaders, cultural bias and cultural competency-based training for the hiring committees. All of that is going to require resources, and resources right now that are very stretched thin, especially in light of COVID, resources that had to be utilized from pockets of money we didn't think we're going to have to use, right, to pay for emergency aid and just transitioning to online learning. So I think that's going to be important to recognize, that as we head into a resource-starved environment, that we continue making the case why that investment is important now more than ever.
Right. Fabrizio or Veridiana, would you like to add anything to that?
I would like to share that something we're very excited to pursue and that we are exploring is the concept of early career development, or career everywhere. This idea of working with especially our incoming freshmen and helping them develop and explore their careers early on before they come to a four-year institution. As we know, many of our first-gen students haven't been exposed to professionals, to careers, to internships, and many times they choose not to pursue higher education because they're not certain about what they want to study, and they're not fully aware that they can always, make that decision, or they can always change their mind. Not that we encourage that, but of course, wanting to go to college but not being 100% certain of what that major should not be a reason why our students of color do not pursue higher education, and a lot of times it is. So working directly with the high schools and being able to bring early career development and exposing students to learning more about their skills, but also their interests and their preferences and their strengths, so that they can feel much more certain and more confident. What we do know for sure is that when students are able to envision themselves in the future, in a career, in a field, having an impact, making a difference, they're more likely to stay focused, and they're more likely to pursue higher education, persist, and eventually graduate. But a lot of times for our students of color, they don't have the opportunities to do that level of exploration. So that's something that we hope to be able to, at some point when we have the funding, to continue to pursue, because we did initiate it, and bring that type of career development into the high schools.
You all mentioned how support starts early on, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of those supports that are happening in high school. So we've seen discussions about removing barriers, such as remediation, the ACT and the SAT, not being required. Quantitative reasoning and ethnic studies classes could create new barriers. How can the systems work together to support students as these changes occur. And I want to bring Kevin back into this conversation too, if he wanted to chime in. Or anyone could take that.
No, I'll start, and then I'm sure that the other panelists have better. Coordination between the systems has always been difficult in California, given the siloed nature and sort of the constitutional independence of UC. There have been a lot more recent efforts recently, particularly exciting to have 3 system leaders that are all people of color for all public systems right now. So that's a benefit. But the other interesting idea, and one thing that will give a lot of key information and help us track students, is the development of the Cradle to Career data system, which will track students in California eventually from K-12 through higher ed and into the workforce. So we'll be able to see better where they fall off and where those barriers exist and for what types of students, and then be able to see what types of wage outcomes. Because there's another issue to this, which is what type of major that you're allowed to get into. There's different admittance rates based on different sort of, not just impaction at CSU, but each different subject area has sometimes a much different sort of demographic makeup. But as far as working together, one really clear example that's been successful is Associate's Degree for Transfer program that was developed, I believe, as part of the Student Success Task Force. But that's grown steadily, and what that did was in CSU and the community college system really worked hard together to try and create a unified curriculum where you could take 30 units and then once you apply and get in, you would be guaranteed to have junior standing in one of the areas that you had applied to. So that has shown a really a skyrocketing sort of growth. There are it needs to be expanded. It would be helpful if UC was more of an active partner in that. But anytime you're working with faculty groups and trying to integrate course numbering and all of that, that takes quite a while. But that's a really promising current policy that could be scaled up, and I know they're working really hard to do that.
That's great.
Yeah. If I can add to that, I mean, Kevin raises a good point, and I'm seeing it tied to some of the questions in the chat as well. That part of what's, and Kevin's right, I think that the fact that the 3 systems don't work together more closely on more things it's flabbergasting to me. So we had an intersegmental CHEBNA, it's called CHEBNA for basic needs across 3 systems. Highly successful, and we learned so much from all of the systems working together. One of the things and it seems simple, but this whole notion of the philosophy of making students be college ready and flipping that and asking, how do we become student ready as universities? And so we've begun taking those frames and asking ourselves a question like, how do we reframe from an equity-based perspective what the problem is, because students tend to be problematized. And then you have people like Professor Tarayasu, who talks about the cultural community wealth and reframes what is it to have students that come from some of our underserved communities, and what is it that they bring as value, navigational capital, aspirational capital. I think we have to challenge the traditional frames of who deserves to go to college and what that means.
That's a good point. Viridiana, do you want to chime in as well?
I was planning to stay on this one, out of this one, just so that I could give my colleagues an opportunity to speak, but I'll speak at the next one.
Sure. And, since we're talking about the earlier years, and the pathway to college, we all, as we know, we're in a pandemic. And a lot of students are throughout California and elsewhere are returning to campus. Today, we saw one of the larger school districts in the Sacramento area return to campus. But most school districts are continuing distance learning. Private schools, many of them have returned with waivers. And this starts to kind of create a bit of an inequity given, what resources students have in front of them. It also might be a difference in extracurricular activities, the kinds of things that we see on college applications. So I'm wondering, from all of you, what can institutions do to ensure that we're leveling the playing field for future applicants, for the soon-to-be applicants, but even 2-3 years from now? Maybe Virginia, would you like to take that, or Fabrizio?
I'll have Fabrizio get started on that one.
And one of the things that happen that you all know is that we are not using standardized tests, right? So SAT and even the graduate programs are not using the standardized tests. I'm glad to see them gone. I think we were already on that track anyway. I think this accelerated that. I think all the studies, most of the studies show that all it is an indication of privilege, right? And who gets a chance to have test taking access or those kinds of resources, and it's usually not people from our community. So I think that I don't think that will come back. I think that standardized tests are going to be extinct from a UC perspective. That's everything that I'm hearing. So that's one good thing I would say that to look forward to from my perspective.
And I'm also really pleased to see SAT, ACT not used as a requirement or a criteria for admissions. The CSU hasn't made the decision yet to not continue to require that for criteria for enrollment, but definitely being considered. But I'm also very pleased to see other policies that used to be barriers, such as remediation, right? Also, we used to have Executive Order 665. We used to require students to complete remediation within a year, and then the students who didn't complete remediation would have to exit the four-year institution and then complete their English and math at a community college, and then their 60 units, and then come in as transfers. So as you can imagine, those types of policies were not only racist in many ways, but they were excluding the students that more need the support, but also the access, right? Because once you're disqualified from the institution that you got in, the likelihood of you coming back decreases significantly. So we are doing an inventory at this time of policies that are not inclusive, that are serving as barriers, and that's just one example. But I'm glad to see, and not just an effort, but a very genuine desire to identify what these barriers are. And I'm glad to see that we're beginning to have conversations that are difficult and very controversial in some ways, but that are definitely finally putting our students as a priority and our students first.
Yeah, I have to echo Dr. Diaz's comments and Fabrizio, because if there's anything that this crisis has taught us, is that we have to, well, one, we were all nimble, and props to the faculty across the state and our colleges for quickly transitioning to online courses, because it was something that people said would never happen, right? And in some institutions, for a system as big as ours, we serve 2.1 million students. There's 116 campuses. That happened in a matter of days to a couple of weeks. So it's taught us things that the possibilities that could be, and so props to them. It's also broadened to the front issues that we knew were already there. And if you're a racial equity champion out there, you've been talking about the affordability challenges of our low-income students. You have been talking for years, especially at PPAC, has written research reports about how placement policies have disproportionately impacted our Black students, our Latino students, our low-income students. And these times are really focused to hone in on with a laser, hone in on, so how is COVID-19 exacerbated the challenges for our students? Because they've certainly kind of pushed them to the spotlight, and that's good for us because it has allowed us an opportunity to showcase to the state legislature, to stakeholders, to ourselves, put the mirror back on ourselves too, a system at least for me, working for the system, that this is the reality of our students. So to Dr. Diaz's point, it is forcing us to have these difficult conversations, sometimes uncomfortable conversations. But I say that these are inspiring moments to really talk about solutions, right? Okay, so we knew these problems existed before. I mean, there are research organizations who've talked about it. They've been there. So what are we doing to address them? And I think on equity, one of the things that we've been talking about in the community colleges is funding. You know, just by sheer design of the master plan, over nearly 70% of our high school graduating class is going to enroll in a community college, just by sheer design, right? Because of the master plan caps. Yet we are not funded at the level per student at the level that the CSU and the UC does. And in the last stimulus care package, we were even more underfunded because of the use of full-time equivalent FTE enrollment over headcount. We got about 25 cents on the dollar compared to the CSU and the UC. And we're talking about serving the most vulnerable, population, the biggest population in the state, and inequitable funding has, can lead to inequitable outcomes. So I'm glad that that is now being talked about front and center. You see that written in articles, conversations in the state legislature. But for us to be able to do this work well and continue implementing, an action plan can only go so far if it's not funded well to be able to support its implementation. So I'm glad that that's at the forefront and will continue to be a priority for us.
And if I can just add that in addition to doing an inventory of policies and having these difficult and uncomfortable conversations, even just looking at the day-to-day practices, I know that in student affairs, we're looking at not necessarily policies, but practices. For example, one of the things that we realized was that our health center, which we refer to as the well, had stopped taking cash because it was easier, right? But didn't realize that many students don't have an ATM card or a credit card, right? So once the associate director realized that this could be a barrier, right? They changed it, right? Or, students who need to take the writing proficiency exam to be able to take upper division courses, they were asking for more than one ID, two IDs, and we had to really look at, is it necessary? Or are we just doing it because it's better for us or easier for us to be able to, confirm identity? Because we have students who may only have one identification, especially our undocumented students, right? Or scholarships that are requiring citizenship when it's not federal funds or it's not state funds, right? And that restriction doesn't have to be there. So there are practices that are not necessarily policies and can be easily changed, right? Immediately changed. So looking at the big policies that will definitely take much more time and energy and politics to change, but then also those day-to-day practices that we have that can be barriers for our students.
Right.
And I can add to Dr. Diaz. I think she hits the nail on the head. I mean, I think the first thing I ask when we're talking about, when someone tells me we can't do that, let me see the policy, right? Because first of all, is there a policy or is it an interpretation of the policy, or was it just a practice that we decided to do at some point? And you'd be surprised how many times that is confused. So I wholeheartedly agree with Dr. Diaz.
I wanted to bring in Kevin for a bit too. I mean, we talked about a lot of these inequities and how they're getting exacerbated. And just going back to the pandemic, I mean, what kind of inequities are we going to see exacerbated for our next, few years of college applicants?
So that's what's kind of tragic about the timing of this pandemic. We're about to release a report in a week, maybe a little bit farther, that was the first sort of examination of how students and outcomes relating to AB 705. So that was the bill that really shifted assessment and placement in community college to multiple measures, as in looking at students' high school grades as opposed to having them take a standardized test on the day. And there was a lot of pushback from faculty and others that were sort of saying this is just sort of pushing them through. But we have seen in just that first year or two before we've gotten to this point, huge increases in students persisting into and completing their next level, transfer level English and math course, math particularly, English, absolutely. So that has the potential, and we've been doing all this work on this end as far as college readiness. You see high school graduations rates going up, A through G completion, which is the college preparatory sequence, going up. And now they're seeing that translate into the community college population. But as Linda pointed out, that's 2.1 million students. And the Community College Vision for Success, which sort of hopes to raise the transfer rate by 35%. 35% is a huge number when you're talking about CSU, who just released a report noting that many of their campuses are already sort of reaching their maximum as far as in-person instruction that they can conduct. So one of the big fears that I have is that we've promised all these students, if they do everything right along the way, that they will have access to a 4-year degree. And that's something that we really need to think about, because it's sort of been, that's again, thinking of this as just one continual pipeline would help us in that front. But with the pandemic, the state funding, though it is a little bit better, or even a lot better than they were anticipating, there's not funding right now to do the kind of financial aid overhauls that we were hoping to do to address the total cost of attendance. So that's one concern. But that not simple, but it took a lot of years of work to get that law passed. But it was really encouraging to see that not only were there increases in the students persisting, but there were no gaps in between student groups once you had removed that initial barrier for them to succeed. Plus, by getting rid of those placing students 5 years below or 4 years below transfer level, it shortens the period of time that they should be able to spend at the community college. So there's some really promising things that were going on. Low income and underrepresented students were starting to do better. Particularly CSU's graduation initiative was helpful, and there was a lot of funding around that. And so right now it's going to be a matter of how do we ensure that higher education policy stays sort of on the top of the agenda, and talking about social economic mobility and what we can use, how we can use it to sort of lift up a lot of those people that maybe have lost jobs during the pandemic. So I'm very excited, and now I'm sort of, I was hoping that we were going to move through, but I think this gives us an opportunity to take advantage of this crisis and sort of kill sacred cows and sort of say new ideas about maybe more aggressive inclusion in the admissions process and making low income a much higher priority. Right now, I think it's one of 14 things that UC looks at in the admissions process. And by maybe changing the eligibility in the local context to, which allows the top 9% of each high school to go automatically to UC, by maybe looking and adding a low income first generation component to that, you might be able to get a little bit, more of what you're missing with some of that availability that Prop 16 would have provided.
Those are great ideas, great points. I want to move on to some questions we have in our chat. I know there's several coming in. I want to give time for you all to answer them. We have a couple questions about the bachelor's deficit. Christopher asks, why isn't California placing more emphasis on the bachelor's deficit by 2025, especially if plans to create a downturn in our economy? He also adds that with 2.1 million students and almost 50% of the post-secondary student population in community colleges and low transfer rates, are community colleges helping California bachelor deficits, or is the community college more of a stopgap for higher education attainment? Linda, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I can elaborate. I did respond to it as best I could in a short commentary in the chat, but I'm glad you raised it so we can speak a little bit more about it. And I'm curious to hear what my colleagues have to say. But You know, I think that the CSU graduation initiative, the vision for success have all been developed because they recognize that there is a severe workforce shortage in the next few years. That was all, I mean, there's a reason why it's also CSU graduation initiative 2025. And when I worked at the Campaign for College Opportunity, this was the basis of our advocacy, is that we recognized that our state was going to be projected to be short. I think it was 1.65 million college educator workers. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin. So all of these efforts have been an attempt to address that. And so when you see us at the Chancellor's Office being very specific about increasing transfer rates, certificates, associate, that is all in response to the workforce demand. Now, you know, the community, I know we serve 2.1 million students. We also have a lot of purposes. Not everybody that enrolls in our colleges and tends to enroll. The majority do, though, but the community colleges also offer CTE pathways, adult education, and there are some colleges that have a pilot BA program, but you know, this is my Linda hat, okay? My Linda hat is we are doing so much already to serve the needs of our 2.1 million students, and to ask every single one of our colleges to meet the BA demand also with no resources or very minimal resources is a lot to ask of a system that is already doing a lot. We are focusing on trying to get those 2.1 million students to meet their educational goals so that they could transfer. So I think this warrants a conversation about capacity, funding to support all of our segments of higher education collectively, and utilizing evidence-based policies to support everyone who is in a college right now to meet their educational goal. Like, that's how you're going to meet the BA demand. I think putting this on the community colleges, one more thing and a big thing, a responsibility is a lot to ask. Kevin,
Good.
wants to chime in.
Fabricio can go first.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, yeah, I think that one thing that we need to make sure that we remember is that community college students, when they do transfer, perform very well in the 4-year space. So if you can, I mean, a lot of that's because those students have had to fight through a lot to get to that point. But as far as increasing transfers to, so right now, for instance, I think the UC system has about a 2-to-1 freshman to transfer ratio. It would be that, given the diversity and the skill sets and the grit that those students show in the community colleges, making sure that there's more opportunity for them to transfer to those more selective universities would likely more quickly diversify those places, and then, but with actually probably increased student outcomes, because there is evidence, I can't off the top of my head bring it up, but it's a community college students who transfer, particularly to some of those schools, do a very good job, and often better than some of the first-time freshmen. So that's one thing to just keep in mind as well. But Fabrizio, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Linda said. I mean, I really think that it's on the UC system and well, I won't speak for CSU, but on the UC system to do a better job of meeting the community college students sooner and in that process, meaning, through concurrent enrollment opportunities, things like that, where they can see themselves on those campuses. And also, I think when we pull apart who our transfer students are, it's a broad swath of experience, right? So how are we responding to students with dependents, our veterans, et cetera? How are we highlighting that we have services at the UC and the CSU that will meet you there, that will support you, and that will give you a sense of belonging? I think that's another important thing is many of our students talk about imposter syndrome and feeling that that's not for them. And I think we have to deconstruct and work with that myth and really work with students to say, no, we need you at these universities.
I'd like to add that in addition to some of the initiatives that have been mentioning for the CSU's, the graduation initiative, we have institutional initiatives such as, finish in 4 and through in 2, because we need to get students to get their degree within 4 years or within 2 years. In the past, our students were taking 6, 8, sometimes 10 years to get a 4-year degree. And for our transfer students, it could be anywhere between 2 to 6 years, not including the time that they had already spent at the community college. So we have worked really hard to create initiatives that get students to commit to taking 15 units, right? Because if we do the math, that adds up to 4 years for incoming freshmen and then 2 years for transfer students. But then also for those students, because many of our students of color and low-income students need to work and they may not be able to take 15 units, we have a provost grant so that they can take classes in the summer, right? So they can make up some of those units in the summer or during our winter break, because typically those are additional tuition fees that they may not be able to afford. So making sure that we provide opportunities for them to finish within a timely manner, right? Because the longer they are at a institution of higher education, you know, the longer it's going to take them to, you know, go out into the real world, into their profession, and start earning, you know, a salary and start contributing to society. So in addition to the access piece is also that when they get here, they have the support, they have the environment, and they have the ability to get out in a timely manner and not spend too many years in college or here at a 4-year institution.
Thank you for that. Our next question is about applications. As you all know, college applications are due soon, and this question is about SATs and GREs. Can you speak more about the institutions, how they're measuring student success without the standardized testing requirements? Does that system include the intersection of multiple identities and that influence on student performance? Is it enough to create a cradle to career database, or should another state level body support collaboration between systems?
So it seemed like there were 3 questions there. I'm not...
Right. I think really the crux of it is, you know, if we're not going to allow, or we're not going to require standardized testing like the SAT and ACT, then how are we measuring performance or eligibility, right, for colleges and universities? Does that change?
I don't have an answer to that, but the only comment I'll make, because the community colleges don't use standardized tests, and the closest thing you could compare it to, the placement exams have now been not eliminated. They, you know, the AB 705, as Kevin mentioned, does not require the campuses to eliminate the test, but to place the students into their courses, they have to utilize high school transcript data. So most of the colleges are required to use either high school grades, the cumulative GPA, the grade that they got in our English or math course. But what I'll say on that is that, you know, as Kevin alluded to, is that our community college transfer students, and 51% of CSU graduates are community college transfer students, 29% are 29% of UC graduates are transfer students, is that they excel and graduate at a faster rate than first-time freshmen. And those who have an ADT, actually the associate degree for transfer pathway at the CSU, graduate 2 times faster than traditional transfer students. And not one of them was required to turn in or showcase their GRE, SAT, and ACT scores for UC or CSU admissions.
Great. Fabrizio, I think I saw your hand up. You wanted to
Yeah,
add.
I mean, I think it's a good question. We use holistic review, and what we do basically is look at, we have a lot of information, like way too much information about the context of that particular high school or community college, how many students on a free and reduced, you know, lunch, how many are first generation, how many low income, you name it, but also a clear indication of what is available to you in terms of the academic curriculum at that particular institution, right? Because you can't compare apples and oranges. If a particular school was more well-resourced and had, you know, 30 AP courses and another one had 5, but you took all 5, then you did everything you could, plus maybe you did cross enrollment at community college. We really want to see that people challenge themselves with what was given to them And then the other parts of it are, how do you talk about your leadership, your participation? And it's not leadership in the sense of standard leadership roles, right? But also, did you have to provide leadership for your family, right? So how do you talk about it and give us a full context of your life and your achievement within that context? And because, to be honest with you, we can accept students with perfect GPAs and perfect test scores, but that's not going to get us the kind of student body that we want, that's going to be representative of the state of California.
We have a couple more minutes if anyone wants to chime in on that question.
I can add, at our campus, we have holistic admission, but it's through equity programs. And while these programs are amazing and phenomenal in so many ways, they're small in nature, right? They can only take so many students, sometimes, less than 100 students each program. So I do hope that, from this pandemic and from having done admission without requiring SATs or GREs as part of the criteria, that we will learn that there's other ways that we should evaluate students' eligibility to perform, right? I think we can look at everything from, GPA improvement, right? If you have a student who improved their GPA, from one year to another, I think that shows a lot of resiliency, right? Or if a student speaks a second language, right? That should count for something. So I'm hopeful that we will get to, we will have the opportunity to use what we're learning from this admission cycle, and that will lead to the implementation of some changes in how we evaluate admissions.
Great. We're wrapping up our hour. I wanted to mention to all of our listeners that there'll be a recording of the event available in a few days, and you can check the Facebook page, Instagram, or Twitter for a link. But thank you so much. I think this was an insightful conversation, and I thank you to all my panelists today for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for attending. Also to our attendees and watching this very important conversation about a very important topic. I would like to invite everyone to continue engaging with HPPA even through the pandemic when we're not holding in-person events. We do a lot of happy houring otherwise, and also policy discussions over lunch. Hopefully we'll go back to that once this pandemic is over. But yes, we'd like to invite people to continue to be engaged with us and other organizations that try to grow our understanding for complex policy issues so we can build a better future. So thank you all again to our panelists, and Saucin, thank you so much for moderating our discussion. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.